My escape from suicide. Possibly the reader will remember that during the year of 1887 there were many cases of suicide in San Francisco. Self-destruction has for more than 30 years been a frequent occurrence in California, owing probably to the rapidity of the transition period through which society had been passing in that state. But during the summer of 1887 there was what might well be called an epidemic of suicide. There were usual conditions attending the death of many of these unfortunates. Usually the reason for self-destruction is not hard to trace. Either ill health, financial disaster, dissipation, insanity, unhappy domestic relations, or disappointment in love are responsible for such occurrences, but several cases happening during the year mentioned were wholly unaccountable. They were among people in good physical health, with good business prospects, happier in their home surroundings, and with every prospect of long and successful lives. Another strange circumstance, which did not at the time cause much comment, was that in nearly every case these people were in the habit of crossing daily upon the ferry boats running between San Francisco and Oakland. There was no special importance attached to this fact at the time, and I believe I am the first person to throw any light upon its significance. During that year I was in the employ of a publishing house in San Francisco. Like hundreds of other young men, I lived in Oakland, going back and forth morning and evening by means of the ferry. One afternoon I left the office earlier than usual, intending to take the 6 o'clock boat. I was 5 seconds late. Stopping to buy an evening paper, I reached the wharf just in time to see the large doors close and to hear the boat move away from the landing. There was nothing for me to do but seat myself in the waiting room and take the next boat half an hour later. Glancing over the paper, the first heading which met my eye was this: "Another suicide. Young man takes his life this morning." No plausible reason can be given for the act. Then followed the details. While reading the account, a man sat down in the seat beside me, and although I did not glance up for several minutes, I felt that he was looking on my paper and reading the story with me. An uncomfortable feeling came over me, a vague, uncertain, unreasonable foreboding of impending trouble, a feeling that I could give no reason for, but which seemed produced by the physical influence of the man beside me. It was with a movement of impatience that I folded my paper and looked at my neighbour. He was a good-looking man, about 50 years old, with large, deep-set black eyes, black hair, and he was dressed in a manner which gave him the appearance of a clergyman. "May I take your paper a moment?" he said in a penetrating voice, as if he were accustomed to command and be obeyed. Glancing at it, he continued, "And still another man weary of life. Well, I only wonder that the world is not depopulated from suicide. The conditions of living in this part of the 19th century are of such a character that it is hardly worth while to struggle against the current. To most of us life is really not worth living, and were I a braver man, the papers of tomorrow would tell of my death, and add one more to the list of self-murderers." "You approve of suicide?" I remarked. "To me it seems only a form of cowardice, inexcusable under any circumstances." "Cowardly not at all," replied my new acquaintance. "It is far from cowardice. A coward would never take his own life. It requires bravery. I have thought much upon the subject, and, with your permission, I will tell you just how the matter appears to me, and what conclusion I have reached." I did not like the man, but I had nearly half an hour to wait, and beside there was something of novelty about hearing a man talk who had thought seriously of taking his own life, so I signified my willingness to listen. It is impossible for me now to recall all that he said, but I remember that I soon became intensely interested in the man and in his story. The feeling of repulsion which I had at first experienced left me, and I seemed fascinated by his personality. He talked of the troubles, disappointments, struggles, and perplexities of human life, of the uselessness of endeavour, of the certainty that death is a dreamless sleep, of the futility of what men term success, and of the emptiness of fame. His voice, which at first seemed hard and unattractive, soon assumed a low, almost confidential tone, strangely soothing and sympathetic. As he talked, I experienced a peculiar feeling of restfulness and of confidence in the speaker. All the objections which I had raised to his theories he met and disproved in so plausible a way that his arguments completely satisfied me. The half-hour soon passed, and when it was time to go aboard the boat, I had no disposition to leave my interesting companion. We took seats together in the cabin, and during our conversation he handed me his card, upon which I read the name Dr. George Kurtz. As I recall now the different portions of my strange experiences with this man, I remember that he frequently looked directly at me, and that as my gaze met his, I thought his eyes wonderfully expressive and their expression kind and sincere. On the opposite side of the cabin, directly in front of us, sat a young man of about my own age who seemed quite well acquainted with the doctor, for they had cordially greeted each other upon meeting as we were going on board. When about halfway to Oakland, I noticed that the doctor was looking intently at the young man, and that the latter was becoming noticeably uneasy. He soon started from his seat, walked quickly toward one of the doors, turned, and again took his seat. He repeated this twice. My new acquaintance had ceased talking with me. Indeed, he seemed for a time wholly unconscious of my presence. The young man now became deathly pale. His hands were clasped together, and his whole appearance indicated extreme distress. Suddenly, as if forming a plan which he determined to execute at once, he sprang from his seat and hurried out to the side of the boat. The doctor and I quickly followed. Reaching the rail, he paused an instant, turned and glanced at the doctor, uttered a piercing cry, and leaped into the water. There was the usual commotion and the usual means for rescue employed, but they were unsuccessful. The body was not recovered until the next day. "Well," said the doctor, turning to me as the boat started on its way again, "I believe he is better off. You knew him, did you not?" I asked. "Slightly. I became acquainted with him a few days ago while waiting for the ferry boat in San Francisco. He was a bright young fellow, but the burden of living became too heavy. When we reached Oakland, the doctor expressed a wish that he might meet me again, and we separated. Somehow I could not get the question of suicide out of my mind, and that night after going to bed I went over my conversation with the doctor. How plausible his arguments seemed! I began to think of my own disappointments, of my failure to attain what I had attempted, of the faithlessness of friends, and of the success of enemies. Before this time I had been decidedly optimistic in disposition and in my judgments of the world, but now the dark side of human existence became painfully apparent. Life seemed so great a burden that I began to wish myself free from it. Then I commenced to speculate upon the various means which one might employ for self-destruction, to consider the comparative advantages of each, and to try to determine which I would use should I decide to end my existence. I remembered that drowning was generally supposed to be an easy way of meeting death, that the sensations as described by those who had been resuscitated after they were apparently dead were not of a painful character. But I had a horror of drowning, and felt that, desperate as I might become, I could never bring myself to the point of leaping into the water. Shooting was, if anything, still more abhorrent, while the thought of the lingering pain which usually accompanies the use of many poisons fairly made me shudder. There were, however, two methods which I regarded in a more favourable light. One of these was the use of some anaesthetic, and the other was to sever a blood vessel and bleed to death. Either of these methods would, I thought, be practically painless, and I decided that should occasion require me to make a choice, I would select one of these. That night I slept but little, and my feverish slumber was made horrible by such dreams as might haunt a man upon the eve of execution. The following day I performed my work in a dazed, mechanical sort of way, and when night came I hurried to the ferry landing, hoping to meet my acquaintance of the evening before. He was there. He greeted me cordially, shaking my hand, and, as I now remember, holding it an unnecessary length of time. At once we began to talk of suicide, and I told him of my conclusions formed the previous night. He at once agreed with me, and added, "It is a remarkable coincidence that we should both reach the same conclusion at the same time, only," he continued, "I went a step beyond you. Last evening I decided that tonight, at midnight, I would cut the radial artery of my left arm, and in that way relieve myself of further trouble and disappointment." He made this announcement as coolly and deliberately as though it were a matter of little moment, and it did not seem to startle or even surprise me in the slightest degree. Taking my hand again and looking directly and steadily into my eyes, he said, "Good-bye. I shall never see you again. If you are wise, you will do as I shall do tonight. Good night. Think of what I have told you." Slowly I turned away and went to my boarding-place. For the first time I realized that I was in the power of this man, that whatever he willed me to do I should do, yet the knowledge brought no uneasiness to me. On the contrary, I was perfectly willing it should be so, for strange as it may appear, I seemed to have perfect confidence in the man, and believed that his influence over me was for the best. When I reached my room, it appeared cold and uninviting, and I experienced such a feeling of depression as I had never felt before. What if I, too, I thought, should take my life at midnight? Who would care very much? Why not end the weariness of existence, the treadmill of monotonous daily tasks? Then I began to consider what preparations would be necessary should I commit such an act, and it all seemed surprisingly easy. It would do no harm, at least, to make these arrangements, and any action would to some extent relieve the horrible weight of gloom which oppressed me. I must do something. Seating myself at my desk, I first wrote a note to my employers in which I gave them some necessary information regarding certain business transactions during the day and some directions about settling my affairs. Then I prepared a note for my landlady, telling her about the disposition of my effects according to my wishes and making proper arrangement about financial matters. Then came the letter home to my people in Maine. As I recall the matter now, this seems the most unaccountable part of my strange experience. Although I am naturally extremely fond of home and friends, I seem then to have lost suddenly all natural affection for the members of my family, and I wrote a most matter-of-fact letter to my father and mother, simply telling them that I was tired of living and bidding them a cool goodbye. The sorrow, the trouble, and the shame which I should bring upon them by taking my own life did not apparently move me for a moment, or indeed even occur to me. After completing these letters, I glanced at my watch. It was precisely 11 o'clock. The writing was finished, and, rising from my desk, I began walking back and forth in my room, while the terrible sense of loneliness and gloom seemed heavier than ever before. Why, I thought, should I not at once take advantage of my preparations? I would never be so easy again, and surely the future offered nothing for which it would be worthwhile to prolong the struggle. I walked to a dressing-table, opened a drawer, and took from it a razor. I touched its blade with my thumb. Its edge was so keen. One quick firm slash across the wrist, which would cause but a moment's pain, and the rest would be easy. I would do it. Instantly upon making this resolve, I experienced a sense of relief, and I went about the details of the final arrangements with as much confidence and coolness as though dressing for an evening's entertainment. I quietly put the room to rights, sealed and directed my letters, placed several books in their places in the bookcase, and folded and put away some articles of clothing which had been returned that day from the laundry. Then I turned some water into the washbowl, removed my coat, and rolled up the shirt-sleeve upon my left arm. Calmly looking at my watch again, I saw that it lacked 5 minutes to 12. I would wait 5 minutes, I thought, and, as the doctor suggested, end my life at midnight. I touched the razor blade to the flesh. A few drops of blood appeared on my wrist, and I remember the feeling of surprise that it hurt so little. Then a clock in the neighbouring church steeple began to slowly count off its 12 strokes. Just as the sound of the last stroke ceased, I extended my arm over the bowl, grasped the razor firmly, and nerved myself for the final act. Suddenly, I felt a reaction, a relaxing of the muscles, a sensation of coldness in hands and feet, and before the blade reached my wrist it dropped from my hand. For a moment I stood trembling, shivering, with cold perspiration starting from every pore. The shock that I experienced was such as comes to a man rescued from an unseen death. The tension upon my nerves was more than I could bear, and I sank to the floor. Grey dawn was just taking the place of darkness when I regained consciousness, and it was several minutes before I could collect my confused thoughts sufficiently to recall what I had passed through. Oh, the horror of it when I began to realize my escape! It was like a dreadful nightmare, but there upon the floor was the razor, upon my wrist was the slight cut made by its sharp blade, and there upon the desk was the letter which I had so coolly prepared. All these formed ample proof that it had been a reality and not a dream. That day I was too weak to go to the office, but late in the afternoon I went out upon the street, hoping that the fresh air might benefit me. At once I was startled by the cry from a newsboy, "Here's your evening bulletin, all about the latest suicide." I bought a paper, and upon the first page were these headlines: "Still another suicide. Dr. Kurtz of this city takes his own life at midnight. At one time a professional hypnotist, lately his friends have regarded him as mildly insane. Severs an artery and bleeds to death." It is not necessary for me to offer any further explanations. I had been under the influence of this man, and his death had saved my life. Moreover, there was no longer an epidemic of suicide in San Francisco. You will say, of course, that this story is widely improbable. It is, but I have given you the facts. You may form your own conclusions.